Welcome to the Wizards of Biobanking podcast. I'm Shrikant Adiga, CEO of OpenSpecimen, and I will be interviewing biobankers from different backgrounds and countries to learn and explore the world of biobanking. Hope you will enjoy this interview series as much as we enjoyed producing it. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the third edition of Wizards of Biobanking. Today I have with me Cassandra Griffin, who heads the biobank at University of Newcastle / Hunter Cancer Biobank. I let her, clarify since they seem to have many different names. So, Cassandra, welcome, and let us quickly start with your introduction and what do you do, what you have been doing before this, etc.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real privilege to be invited. I'm the Biobanking and Clinical Research Manager at the University of Newcastle. The biobanking platform that I manage used to be Hunter Cancer Biobank. That was its origin. And it started out as a collection of formalin-fixed tissues that was set up in conjunction with New South Wales Health Pathology. And then it started to grow. So with support from the Cancer Institute New South Wales, we included a sequential blood collection of samples, again, all through cancer. And then we started to expand even more, and we started to collaborate with some external groups, such as the ALLG or breast cancer trials, sarcoma, some diabetes studies, fertility studies. And we sort of decided at that point we couldn't really call ourselves a cancer bank just anymore. And also we were providing other services in terms of sample processing, some staining and other laboratory work. So at that point, to recognize the growth and to recognize the fact that we were working all throughout regional New South Wales, that was when we rebranded to New South Wales Regional Biospecimen Services. So that's kind of our base. And we've got Hunter Cancer Biobank within there and the Mark Hughes Foundation Brain Cancer Bank in there. And then also our cooperative group partners are in there as well.
That is interesting because when we started, the product was named CA tissue, which standard for cancer tissue, until we started doing a lot other things. So we had to become OpenSpecimen to indicate that we are not just cancer or for that matter tissue. So that sounds interesting. So you talked about breast cancer, brain cancer, and the third group. So the third group or other groups, do they do non-cancer studies? Any other disease that you guys work on?
Yeah, so it's not just breast and brain. There's also a lot of hematological work and sarcoma, but outside of cancer, diabetes, preterm birth. There's a bank of violent offenders samples. There's, thinking off the top of my head now, what else do we have?
Do you do anything in COVID?
Not specifically, no. A lot of that was put through the statewide bank and through some of the government infrastructure. So no, we did have samples that were collected during the time. There was some COVID work in conjunction with a multiple sclerosis bank that we helped curate. So, I mean, realistically, we're the custodians and we help people manage their sample collections, but right. Yeah, they're the ones driving the research agendas.
Okay, sounds good. So let's talk about you. Can you give us some idea of what did you initially do? What is your education background, and how did you get into biobanking?
Before biobanking, okay. It's a little bit different to most people. I think most people's career path is sort of fairly linear. Mine looks a little bit like an Escher painting with stairways going everywhere. I actually started out in the performing arts. So I trained, I trained to perform in musical theatre, and I did a little bit of work on stage and backstage in musical theatre. And also, wow. Not the answer you were expecting, I'm guessing. So that's where I started. I did an arts degree in performing arts, anthropology, and ancient history. I've always had a passion for ancient history. And then in my third year, I was doing a subject on health and disease in the ancient world. And graduating my arts degree, not entirely sure what a stable career might have looked like coming out of that and being really interested in this health and disease subject, I took a sharp turn, and as soon as I graduated, enrolled in biomedical science, again at the University of Newcastle. So I completed a biomed degree there and then went on and studied a Master of Public Health at the University of Sydney, mostly focusing on infectious disease control and epidemiology, and then worked in that space for a little while before going into cancer clinical trials, running away to London for a couple of years and working in medical communications. And then I came back and found the wonderful world of biobanking. But it's interesting, even though I hadn't necessarily been introduced to the world of biobanking until I took on this role, with what I know now and reflecting on my career path up until that point, I was actually engaged in biobanking at numerous points. So, you know, we roll our eyes now when sometimes we get samples in from clinical trial sites that might not be labeled in the best way, or something that's just a little bit tricky to handle. And then I have to stop myself and go, oh, that was you 5 years ago that perhaps didn't quite send through the best sample to the central lab. And again, working in microbiology and in a PC3 environment, we were quite regularly banking the specimens that we produced. But at the time, to my knowledge, we weren't coining it as biobanking. So it's interesting to see how it sort of has always been there in the background of the work I've been doing.
Sure. do you play any musical instruments?
No, I'm a vocalist. So I fronted a band when I was
Wow.
younger.
Wow.
Yeah, and I still do
Okay.
some musical theatre now.
Nice. So we should have a performance in the next ABNA meeting.
We've talked about an ABNA band, and stranger things have happened. Our 20th anniversary conference is on record, so it does have a bit of a musical theme. So
Oh, nice.
should come along, and anything could happen.
So, given the trajectory you had, obviously you have a history of being a self-learner because you have to do so many different things. So how do you keep yourself updated about the latest things happening? Do you read specific journals, blogs, books? Like, what is your go-to for learning new things?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think if you're learning new things and if you're engaged in your field, it's because you're passionate about what you're doing. And one of the reasons why I love this field and I love my job comes down to the people and the connections. So I think the way that I learn is I'm very, very engaged with my peers, both through ABNA and in my own institute. And in those conversations where we're talking about the thing that we love, we're talking about our work, people will reference certain articles or podcasts or even their own research. And in having those discussions, it then prompts you to go and look at more things and read up on things. So I wouldn't say I necessarily have one source of information, but that, my antenna is sort of always out and always on. And I wait until something pikes my interest. I read all of the usual journals that most biobankers would keep their finger on the pulse of, but I'm very open to hearing what's going on around me. And I think as biobankers, it's really important that we are collaborative and engaged with the researchers who are around us, because our resource is what supports their work. And the more engaged and collaborative we can be with them, the better the partnership and the better the research that results. So it's a really long-winded answer to your question.
Right. It happens by osmosis anyway, right? So you have to be curious and keep looking for things that it's not direct teaching anymore once you're out of college. So you have to seek what you're interested in, and that's what is interesting. Absolutely.
And isn't that why we all went into science? When we're biospecimen scientists, it's not just biobankers, because we're always asking questions.
Right. So moving on to the biobank itself, you briefly talked about what the biobank does. Every biobank is different in the way it operates. Some are, just storing specimens. Some are interacting with patients. Some are somewhere in the middle. So in the work that you guys do you get involved in the collection process, or is that all done by the researchers and you are once the researchers collects the specimen, it comes to you guys?
It really depends on the study. So for a lot of our external studies, they're collected on site by trial coordinators, and that's managed centrally. So we just receive the samples to process, or sometimes they're already processed and we just bank the final sample. Particularly for the Mark Hughes Foundation Brain Cancer Bank, we are hands-on and face-to-face with the patients, and we can do home visits to have consent conversations in a place where the families are comfortable. We go onto the wards. That's a very, very patient-facing kind of element to our bank. So we cover the full spectrum.
Nice. When you're doing that, how do you work on getting more people enrolled or more people involved with the biobank from a patient or a participant point of view, or is it pre-decided as to who gets involved and you're not really in charge of enrolling?
So we're not in charge of the external collections. That's all sort of done through the organization's publicity. But our internal collections, like the Mark Hughes Biobank, a lot of it's done through community awareness, and they have patient forums. We're very, very fortunate that we have these amazing brain care coordinators who are on the ward and the first point of call for patients. So they will introduce biobanking very early on when they're first introducing themselves to patients. And then they sort of tap me in at a time that seems appropriate. So we're lucky, given that it's a regional area. I think people communicate differently and we interact slightly differently. So it's very personable. It's very who you know. We don't. Right. We do some online promotions, and the Mark Hughes Foundation have been fabulous with that. And we recorded a piece for a current affair, which went nationally. But most of the time, it's just on the wards, talking to people, spreading the news that way.
So now moving on to the actual specimens and processing. So as for each study has its own way of. So before that, how many people work in the biobank? What is your total strength?
Our team, there's about 8 of us, so we're a fairly big team.
Right, and so how do you keep? How do you manage training? Keep the team updated or on new things? Are there regular trainings, etc., that happens?
I wouldn't say regular training that happens. We obviously keep our finger on the pulse to any opportunities. So if the university does raise training opportunities, or there's an opportunity for the team to attend ABNA or ISBA or any of those conferences, we're always very keen to have representation. We're also really keen for the team to stay closely engaged with the partners that we work with. And I think they learn a lot by that consistent interaction. Right. I mean, we do have quality management processes in place for, safety training and those kinds of standard operating protocols. All the usual stuff is in place, but skill development, we would look for conferences and that type of thing.
So these 8 people are the ones who work in the biobank, not the ones who are going to the patient to collect specimens, right? So that's more of the clinic coordinators or whatever.
Yeah, well, we can actually do both. So I spend a lot of my time with patients, and I probably spend more time than most of our group face-to-face with patients, but we've all done it. We're quite subspecialized in our team. So we have a blood processing team. We also have a team working on histology-related research, so immunohistochemistry, developing tissue microarrays, that kind of thing. So it really depends. Everyone kind of has their niche, but I'm always really encouraging and really keen for the team to, step in somebody else's shoes, learn what they're doing for a day, and to cross-skill and learn from each other wherever we can.
So you talked about the part where you personally or others interact with the patient directly. That must be probably the most meaningful or the most interesting part of the job, right? Where you're actually meeting people who either you are directly impacting or indirectly contributing to the purpose. Can you talk about that? I mean, that seems it's like for us talking directly to customers where we get to learn so many more things than when you're not doing that. So ultimately these are your so-called customers.
Yeah, I feel really, really privileged that we're able to see that full life cycle from meeting a patient, collecting a sample, and then seeing it all the way through to going out the door, producing data, and then seeing the publication. So I feel really privileged that as a bank, we can work right across that spectrum. And engaging with the community is by far my favorite part of this job. I mean, we don't biobank for the sake of papers. We biobank for the sake of improving outcomes for people. Or even, I shouldn't just talk about humans. For me, it's humans, but I mean, thinking about veterinary and agricultural bankers, we biobank to help people. That's the goal. So I think knowing that there's somebody at the other end of this and knowing that someone has trusted you with their sample, it makes it a lot more real. And I think it makes what we do feel a lot more special, for want of a less tacky word. But I think I may have mentioned to you previously, we have a post-mortem bank. So
Yes.
people with advanced brain cancer can consent to donate their brain upon their passing. That's a really emotional situation for families, and the consent conversations are extremely emotional. And that's why we often do those in the person's home where they're most comfortable and surrounded by their support network. But it's amazing the weight and the value that those specimens have afterwards, because we can attach a story to them. And yes, they're de-identified. And yes, we're adherent with everything in terms of ethics and making sure that everything's completely secure and not re-identifiable. But just knowing the types of people that have made those contributions, it makes us as custodians feel like we really have something, not just of value financially or to research, but of value to someone else. That's their legacy, and we're responsible for it.
Correct. And this is the true bed to bedside. Right? So,
absolutely. Yeah, we are. I mean, we're the cornerstone in translational research. That's what biobanks are.
Right. Yeah, that's truly amazing. So, do you also work with pharmas or external research, commercial research groups to provide specimens?
Yeah, we do. So we're working with a couple of startup companies at the moment, not necessarily big pharma yet. But hey, if you know anyone, we're keen to talk. But no, we're working with a couple of startups just to help them work through optimizing protocols and doing some drug screening and that type of thing. And that's really great as well, because they come from a different way of thinking and they have different expectations. So it's a great learning curve for us. And also working with those partners who have slightly different resources at their disposal makes us a lot more financially sustainable, because we aren't institutionally funded. So we need to make sure that we split our time and we split our labor across industry or external bodies, and also the researchers that are grant funded within our own institution.
Makes sense. So then how do you publicize your biobank? I know you're doing an amazing job, because coincidentally we just started to work with CSIRO, who selected you as the biobank. So obviously you're doing a lot of right things. So how do you publicize your biobank? Or the second part of the question is, obviously for someone like CSIRO to select you through a tender process, you are doing something right inside the biobank, which is why the people would select you, right? So how do you do both of them, publicize and maintain the internal processes?
So publicity largely happens through our website, and we do seem to get quite good traffic on our website. But the challenge with that is making sure it's always up to date. You can't just set up a website and hope it maintains itself. But that's where a lot of our contacts come from. The second place, and probably the most prominent place that our new contracts come from, are word of mouth from our existing clients. So if you do your job and you do it well and you keep your partners happy, they tell their friends. So we're very, very grateful to some of our first partners who came on board who have done that for us. CSIRO was slightly different. It was a tender process.
Right.
And I think it's been something that's been really important to us, and something that I think a lot of biobanks are starting to think about. And that's that if we're going to engage with business or with industry, that we do need to start thinking about what we do and implementing business processes. And that means being familiar with competitive tenders, knowing how to prepare a request for pitch document or something like that, and engaging a little bit more with marketing strategy and long-term, strategic design around what the offerings of a biobank are, how we differ between biobanks. CSIRO pointed out to us that As biobanks, we've always traditionally worked with researchers, and a lot of us trained as researchers, so we understand how researchers work. But if biobanks are going to interact with industry and with business, then biobanks also need to understand how industry and business work and need to start operating as a business in ourselves to some degree. And that means knowing how to, when you receive an RFP, a request for pitch, knowing how to put together a pitch document, knowing how to engage with the tender process, having pricing structures and business models and, you know, strategic plans that allow you to continue your engagement while also offering a sustainable and secure service to the people that you're engaging with. So I think it's partly about understanding the people that we're working with and then looking at how we can learn and grow ourselves to make it a more productive two-way relationship. And I'm very lucky that my time in London was in a medical education agency where we pitched and we constantly went in on tenders. So that was a great way to learn in a pretty thriving, happening city, a pretty good way to learn how to deal with those kinds of challenges.
That sounds very interesting. First of all, from music to research to now, you know, so that's a pretty good transition. And you know, again, a lot of similarity in terms of how we do stuff where, you know, today we work with about 85, 90 biobanks or academic research centers across 20 countries. Pretty much everything is because of word of mouth, references, people talking to each other. And, you know, that's how we, especially in the research community or the academic world, a lot of interaction, a lot of collaboration between centers, which kind of helps us to, people know people, you know, then the word keeps growing. So yeah, very interesting stuff. So let's move on. So it's, you know, since you do a lot of patient enrollment and things like that, so how do you manage consent? Do you obviously one is it a broad consent for research, or do you have a specific you know, individual consentiers or statements that people can choose, and then how is it recorded? Is it done electronically, on paper, etc.?
So it's a broad consent for unspecified research. That's the model that we've been working with since we first started. It is still a paper-based consent model. We are hoping to move to e-consent soon, but for now, just because we're working across multiple sites and, you know, IT infrastructure and things that isn't always great in some of the regional hospitals, we've stuck with paper-based consent. And that's usually done by the clinicians when they first engage with the patient, and then we get notified once consent's been obtained.
And do you, when you come back and upload that data, do you upload it in your EMR or some recorded somewhere else?
So for certain streams where we've got surgical coordinators who are able to put the consent in the EMR, it naturally goes into their file through the hospital, but that's probably the minority. Most of the time when we're facilitating consent, we have a paper-based filing system to keep the originals, and then everything else is uploaded into our database.
Okay.
So hard and electronic copy just for backup.
Okay. I think I know a thing or two about your database, so we'll come to that in a bit.
I think you might.
So now moving on to managing biospecimen, and two things is super important when it comes to biospecimen. So one is how do you manage quality? How do you make sure the biospecimen is in a, you know, the security, safety, and the quality of the specimen, and then you know, having biospecimen without, even if it might be a high quality biospecimen, but not having good quality data associated with the biospecimen, again makes it pretty much useless. So let's talk about how do you manage quality of the biospecimen first, in terms of its processing and storage, backups, you know, those kinds of things.
So, I mean, quality starts at collection. So if we're not the ones collecting the sample, if it's being collected at a site, we try to be involved right from the development of the laboratory manual, and we try to also get involved during site initiation visits so that we can come in right at the start and help support those teams to collect and process the best possible sample they can. If we're doing the processing, so everything that we do when we set up a new study or a new collection, we have a full suite of standard operating protocols that are developed for that sample. We have a training system throughout our team to make sure everyone's compliant with that. And that regularly gets checked just through the levels of seniority within our processing team. We are New South Wales statewide biobank certified. So all of our SOPs for our basic practices have been submitted and approved. And we're also ISO compliant. So we haven't yet gained accreditation, but we're compliant. And we're always mindful of the recommendations for quality and processing from that avenue. I guess consistency is key. Keeping records is key, and we note down absolutely everything. So we track our samples from the moment they walk in the door until the moment that they're frozen. And obviously we use the OpenSpecimen database to make sure that everything is where we say it is when we say it's there. So ensuring that we have a full record of everything that's happened at any time with notes of any deviations or anything that might have interrupted a protocol is really important to us. Physical security. So our laboratory is all swipe card accessible, and all of our databases and infrastructure systems are all password accessible. They're also in a locked building after hours, and you need special permission to be able to get into there. The records are all stored in the physical lock and key. Data becomes slightly trickier. So a lot of our data, we do have minimum data sets that we store with each sample, but we also do a little bit of bespoke data mining when the researcher has appropriate ethics in place. And that's extremely arduous and not something that we have sorted completely. I think it's something that we're hoping we can move to a better system in the future. And we're talking to various parties about how we do that. But you're right, the data can make or break a specimen. And, you know, having all of that additional context, I guess, to explain any deviation or anything that you might find in your sample is what gives meaning to the data that you're producing. So it's a work in progress, but we do have a minimum data set that's stored along with every sample.
Right. And the bespoke data that you mentioned, is that the analysis part of the data, or the data that you collect from the patients or the specimens?
It's more what we're collecting. So somebody might be after, I'm trying to think of an example. So potentially a steroid. They might know that the marker they're looking at is particularly steroid sensitive. Now, that may not be something that we would necessarily record in our minimum data set. So provided there's the appropriate ethics in place from the researcher, we then go back to the source files and we would manually comb through and look for someone's history of steroid use and how that might be reflected in the time points that we've given them from our collection.
Okay.
So very labor heavy.
Sure. So, and what about, say, the inventory or the freezer management? And so are they all on site? Are they, do you have an off-site storage location? Or, you know, how many freezers do you have right now?
Oh, I couldn't give you an exact number. I think it's about 8 or 10 at the moment. They are currently all on the one site, but that's likely to change in the next couple of weeks. We're getting another couple set up on Callaghan just due to storage capacity. We also have the liquid nitrogen dewars that are on site as well, and everything is catalogued through OpenSpecimen.
Right. And when you're storing specimens, do you also do things like rare specimens have a backup in a different freezer? How do you manage some of those things? Anything
so that
specific?
is something that used to be really popular, that you split a collection across multiple freezers. And we were actually speaking about this in an ABNA context the other day, because it's not really standard practice anymore, from my understanding, for a lot of banks to do that. I think if your safety protocols are appropriate and you have the appropriate checks and balances, alarms, monitors, you know, and industry approved freezers, then touch wood, realistically, I mean, if you're losing half of your collection, you've lost your power calculation anyway. So having half of them often undermines the value. We always have backup freezers. So if anything were to fail on us, we could do a very quick transfer across to a newer freezer. But generally speaking, and from speaking with a lot of my colleagues, the idea of splitting them across 2 freezers isn't something we do have one study that requests it, but it's generally not the primary practice anymore.
Yeah, all specimens are rare, so you might as well take care of all the specimens.
Yeah, and as I say, it's about power. If you lose half, well,
Yeah. So now about the data part, you I think already touched upon things like having minimal data set and using OpenSpecimen, etc. So how do you use this data to publicize your or share the data with your researchers, so that your specimen utilization rate improves, or people get access to what you do? When I say people, I'm talking about researchers, not the participants.
Yeah, so it depends what they're after, really. I mean, we can export a lot of our clinical data is stored in REDCap. So the sample data is obviously stored in OpenSpecimen, and we can export that if that's what researchers are after. If they're after more than just very basic demographic, that's when we would do a larger export from REDCap, or we'd create a bespoke data set through data mining, and it's usually just passed over in spreadsheet form, unless they're after imaging data, which is becoming more and more common. And imaging data is usually transferred using using external hard drives and things like that, pending data security and different regulations around external devices.
Sure. Any plans to do online cataloging?
We would love to. We would absolutely love to. We're currently doing an overhaul and an audit of our formalin fixed collection, which is at about 55,000 samples. So once we get that sorted, we'll be able to re-upload everything. And then the goal would be an online catalog. Absolutely.
Right. So now coming to the end of the how specimens gets utilized. We talked a lot about collection, processing, etc. So how do you engage with your researchers who need these specimens? So how do they come to know about your biobank? How do they approach you? How do you manage that process?
Well, probably a little bit different, because I trained in the university that I now work. So a lot of the researchers I work with taught me back in the day, and I'm still located in the same building as them. So a lot of it's a hallway conversation, if I'm honest. But no, in terms of formal processes, so we do publicize throughout university newsletters, and we have our website. So people who are looking for samples are directed to us. People will generally approach us just with a very broad inquiry to find out what's available in the first instance. Based on that, we can then provide a quote for cost recovery. And once that's been accepted by the researcher, we then move through the governance process, which involves the submission of a sample request form. That gets reviewed by our scientific advisory committee for the bank. Once approved, we can then start to distribute samples to the researcher. If they're an external researcher, we then also have the MTA process and service agreements and things that come into play there.
Interesting. So now that you talked about cost recovery, how do you sustain the biobank as a whole? Obviously, we touched upon a lot in terms of external projects you do and things like that. But from a cost recovery point of view, one of the challenges that most biobanks face is sustenance and cost recovery and things like that. And that kind of is a hot topic in pretty much every conference. So what do you have to say about that? And what are the things that you guys do right, or might want to change in the way you do or others do?
It's hard. I mean, when I took on this job, I was told in the next 5 years, you need to ensure that the bank is 100% cost recovered. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that is actually possible. I could be wrong, but I don't think anybody has managed to do that 100%. But what we did was we stripped everything right back, and we looked at everything that we do for our partners, and we broke it down by minute. How many minutes does it take this? And we did this for all of the tasks, and we developed quite an extensive pricing module based on labor and consumables. And we've had to stick to it. I mean, there's always scope slide, and there's always hallway conversations and things like that. And you can't take the collaboration and the good faith out of research. I think when you start charging for collaboration, you take the magic out. So there's a fine line between being able to cost recover everything and being able to keep those relationships in a positive sense. But I do think we've handled it fairly well. We tend to sit at around about 80% cost recovery for our overall operations, and that's inclusive of all staff labor and consumables.
And that sounds much higher than what a usual industry average would be, or do you have any idea of you said 80%? Do you think, do you have any industry idea of how much is the cost recovery of other biobanks?
From what I understand, and I could be speaking completely out of turn, I think that's fairly high compared to most biobanks. And I think that's because a lot of biobanks have either institutional support or are entirely reliant on grants, because we do have external partners. I mean, we can't have external partners if we can't offer them security. And they won't feel secure banking with us if they don't think we're going to be here in 5 years.
Right.
So it's it's a bit of a dance and a bit of a balance. I mean, you know this more than me. I think the general idea is that a business should be able to run on around about 10% administrative or infrastructure costs. Right. So with that in mind, I'd love to think that we could cost recover another 10% and keep ourselves at 90. And I feel like that's best case scenario. But we're working with our institution, who are really supportive. And we're looking to figure out where we can provide the most value and ensure that we keep up our commitments while also not.
Let's talk about the database part. So I'll divide that question into two. Before we get to OpenSpecimen specifically, obviously you've been using OpenSpecimen, I think, for the past 5-6 years now.
Almost longer than that, to be honest, because I've been at the bank for 5 years, more like 8, I think.
Right. So therefore, if a biobank who is using Excel sheets or something else, in-house database, etc., is now looking out for a new database or setting up a more streamlined process, other than telling them to use OpenSpecimen, what would be your suggestion about how should they go about the process?
I think with these kinds of databases, you need to keep in mind that the field we're working in is extremely dynamic, constantly evolving and forever changing, which means we as biobankers need to be able to pivot on a dime and restructure the way we do things. And if that's going to be possible, the LIMS system that you're working with has to be customizable. And I think that's one of the greatest strengths of OpenSpecimen. Yes, it can make the user experience a little bit intimidating sometimes because it is so powerful and it is so customizable. But I think once you get past that and see it as a strength, to me, that's been one of the greatest strengths of us working with you guys. And that would be one of my recommendations to anyone looking for a new LIMS, is find something that is customizable. I would also say the second most important thing, perhaps even the first most important thing, is to find a biobanking platform or a LIMS where you have sufficient support and where the provider of that LIMS sees themselves as a partner and someone working with you and who is invested in the industry, so that you can work together to provide the best possible solution for the industry. So if it's just a quick off the shelf and you never hear from them again, I would suggest that's not going to be a great relationship moving forward, because the industry moves too quickly.
Right. So what has helped us is kind of one is continuously working with closely working with people like you, and also second is as we add more customers, each one of them have their own additional, they like it for 95%, but we want this 5% more, right? So as we do that, the overall solution becomes more powerful for everyone. So
Yes.
that kind of adds up.
Absolutely.
Like for example, CSIRO, whom we are just starting to work, in fact this week, has a very interesting requirement of wanting to send a welcome email to the patient, and with the consent as a PDF, so that they can download, review offline, and before they come to the clinic, or send a follow-up email to certain subset of patients, things like that. So again, something like this, is something that might be useful to another 5 or 10 people, who are already using OpenSpecimen, but they might be doing all these things manually outside. Someone is kind of downloading the names, attaching email addresses, sending out emails on there. This one, the whole thing can be automated now.
I think that's something that, and something I haven't considered as being part of OpenSpecimen, but something we hear a lot, particularly from the families of people who have donated samples post-mortem, is that they want follow-up. And obviously we can't tell them this specific sample was used in this specific project. That would be unethical. But just to let them know the sample has been used. So, if there was an ability to, when you distribute a sample, to let the family or the donor know, FYI, your sample's now being used, I think that would be a really, really wonderful functionality.
Right. Yeah, that would be amazing to get an email to know that what you contributed to is actually getting used somewhere at the end. So that would be an amazing email to get. So so we are coming towards the end. So let's talk about OpenSpecimen. So you already mentioned, so we have been working for about 7-8 years. Time flies. I thought it's around 4-5 years. So you talked about the customizable and configurable part of OpenSpecimen. How do you other than these 8 people who work in the lab, do any of the external people also have access to OpenSpecimen for anything?
Absolutely. So our external partners, our collaborative groups that we work with, they can all view things and they can run their own queries. And I feel like a little bit of a fraud in that Jenna Bowen, who I work with, does most of this side of what we do. So she can speak to it in a lot more detail. But Jenna sets people up in a way that they can then query their own samples and be able to run a lot of those reports without having to get things from her, though that report functionality is what she uses when she provides her quarterly or monthly report to our clients. But they do have limited access.
Nice. So do you know how many such people are there who are not part of the lab but have access, like a rough number of, just a random number?
There's at least...
Is it 10 to 20, 50 to 100?
There would be 4 or 5 collaborative groups, and I would say there's probably 4 or half a dozen maybe in each of those groups who would have access.
Nice. So that's about 20 to
massive numbers, but
yeah. So how do you manage training? When you onboard either a new employee or some of these research groups from external sites that join. So how do you manage training them on using OpenSpecimen? How do you onboard a new employee?
So that definitely falls to Jenna and her wonderful skills. So Jenna has some training protocols set up, and she's also got some dummy protocols that she's able to walk people through. I've sat in on with her a few times when she's onboarded new clients and walked them through various queries, and she shows them how to set up and that type of thing. I believe she's directed them some of the online resources that you've provided as well. So we've certainly made use of those when it's been relevant. But a lot of the time it's just sitting with people and walking them through it and answering questions as they come up. I think with a system like OpenSpecimen, you really need to get your hands dirty. You need to be in there working with it. It's not something you can just passively watch. So we're very keen to get people using it, and then we support as queries come up.
Okay, so we are pretty much towards the end of this. So let me just see if I got any other question. So one of the things that so when you give samples out to researchers and they do their research, etc., do they return data back to you guys? Do you store that in OpenSpecimen?
There isn't an official mechanism for that, and that's something that I think we'd really like to address in the near future, purely by the nature of how we work and the fact that we're in a smaller community compared to some regions. We're often acknowledged on papers, we keep in touch with the researchers, and for want of a better term, we have repeat offenders. So people do keep coming back, and we are aware of the data that's been generated, and we can often, if we know someone's wanting to do something similar, we'll make that connection and put people in touch. But in terms of a formal mechanism for receiving data back and adding additional value to the specimen, we're not there yet, but we would love to be. that's definitely a future direction.
So moving on, let's talk about ABNA a bit. ABNA stands for Australasian Biobanking Network. Biospecimen Network Association. And you are the president of the current president for the, I think, until the end of next year or this year. So let's talk about ABNA. What is ABNA and how does it contribute to biospecimen science in Australia, New Zealand, etc.? And why should someone join or attend ABNA conferences?
So ABNA, it's the professional network, and one of its main intentions is to disseminate learnings, facilitate networking, and to build a community so that people aren't reinventing the wheel. We are able to learn from each other, and we're able to grow and progress the discipline of biospecimen science forward. I say biospecimen science, not biobanking, because I think over the last couple of years, we've really actively worked to show that what we do is a discipline and a profession in itself. And there are skills and there is a knowledge base that comes with being a biobanker or a biospecimen scientist. And it's really important that we recognize that unique skill set. I'm probably an example of someone who greatly benefited from ABNA. So as I said to you, I came into this job not entirely sure what I was doing or how I got here. And it was suggested to me by a colleague from another institution that I attend an ABNA meeting in Melbourne. And it was going there and meeting a number of colleagues who then twisted my arm into joining the committee that absolutely changed the trajectory of my career as a biobanker. I have learned so much. I have had my eyes open to so many different opportunities, ways of working and ways of interacting. And I think biobanking at times can be a lonely profession. We're often small teams embedded within universities or other infrastructure, and we don't have access to other people who are doing what we do. We often work in isolation. So ABNA is wonderful at being able to create that peer network and allowing you to interact with people who are facing the same challenges as you, have the same opportunities as you, and can really get you thinking differently. And I know you were at our conference in Perth last October, and I personally feel like that was a great example of that, when we had seed bankers talking about challenges that resonated with veterinary bankers that were also relevant to somebody banking cancer. Right. So the more we can learn and the more we can network, the stronger we are as a community.
Yeah, I think we have been coming for ABNA for quite a few years now. I don't remember when we started, but obviously COVID had its own impact. But otherwise, I think we have at least attended 5 or 6 ABNAs. So, the ABNA conference is in October?
Yes, and this is definitely not one to miss. So this year it's October 18th, I believe, and we're at SeaWorld on the Gold Coast. So being our 20th conference, it really is going to be something special. The theme is on record. So we're looking at some of the past successes and some of the greatest hits, and then where the industry could be going forward after this. But there's some real surprises in the program and some wonderful things that you can only do at SeaWorld. So I really think this year will be special, and I'm hoping we have a really good turnout this year.
Plus some musical. Plus some musical, right?
Look, I'm not committing to anything. I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah, I think, not being a biospecimen scientist, not being someone who runs a biobank, being someone who comes from a computer science background, something like ABNA where we go and not that we attend like every session there, but so many interesting things that we get to hear. One of my favorite sessions from the last ABNA was the koala. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes.
The session on how someone is doing research on that to increase the population of koala. I mean, it was, so those kinds of things is very interesting, which probably would get only in a conference like ABNA.
And that's the goal. And as you say, if that's not necessarily your background, that's a strength of ABNA, because science doesn't happen in a bubble. We have to be multidisciplinary. We have to work with our peers. And I think that's what ABNA has always been very committed to, is having that richness and, giving everybody a voice and showing the various roles that people have to play in the biobanking world. So that just shows me that we hit our mark.
Did I pronounce it right? Is it koala?
It is koala. He was tracking them with drones, I think, from
koala.
memory.
Yeah.
Koala.
Yeah. Koala. Yeah. Okay, so that brings.
Have you met one? Have you met a koala?
I definitely seen probably in some zoos, but the one that I'm going to talk about is not koala, but in Melbourne, in Murdoch Children's Hospital, they have a section for. Now I'll have to ask Purnima which one, but they have because it's a children's hospital, right? So they have a section where one of this. Something similar to koala, meerkat. Purnima is saying it's meerkat.
Yes, a meerkat.
Yeah, so that's interesting too. So you can go there and sit, and you can see them running.
We'll have to arrange for you to have a koala encounter and actually hold a koala the next time you're down.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Maybe a dolphin at SeaWorld.
Oh yeah. So that's pretty much the kind of things that we wanted to cover. Anything that you want to add to before we wrap up the session?
Just other than to say thank you for having me. It's been a really wonderful opportunity to chat with you.
Yeah, same here. And this is something that we are doing as an effort to generally talk to people like you. Get a better understanding, which helps. It's been personally been a very educative, enriching experience. But I think in general, having a record of such a discussion is useful for, say, new biobankers, people who are setting up new biobanks, just learning, and also getting to know who they can talk to if they have similar things to discuss in great detail. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I probably, if you don't mind, I should just add on that note of wanting to know who to get in contact and who to network with. ABNA will be launching special interest groups towards the end of this year. And that's one of the goals of that, is for people, like-minded people confronting challenges or with similar interests, can come together and actually create those communities to be able to phone a friend and do things like that.
Right.
We'll be launching that later this year, which will be exciting.
Yep, sounds good.